that God loves poor people more, that God loves those who are suffering at the hands of others more than they love the ones who are doing the oppressing. You're the golden red got the strength to carry on, Hello, beautiful soul family. Britt Cannon here, host of the Walk On podcast, the podcast where I try to demystify spirituality, personal growth and healing, and whatever else I feel like talking about. This week's episode is called Jesus fucking Christ, and it's about the man, the myth, the legend, the revolutionary, the maybe totally made up historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus fucking Christ. How he really resonates with me as far as awakened figures throughout history. You know, we have like every so often one of these people pops up who's very charismatic, who's very knowledgeable, who's very enlightened, who inspires, you know, everyone they meet to follow suit, to become enlightened as well. And there's this belief in the spiritual community that these people, what they do is they cause a sort of, almost like an earthquake causing a seismic shift. They cause a shift in consciousness, which then makes it easier for others to awaken, to become aware. And a lot of the teachings of Jesus, if you read them, are very what is called liberation theology centered. This is like a new-ish term, but it's basically like people whose spirituality is entwined with their political activism. It's about these spiritual faiths that are rooted in the plight of the poor and the marginalized and the oppressed. So instead of being like fortune favors the rich, you know, the way that these like mega churches, white capitalist Christian America, how they see a virtuousness to people who have money, you know, that if you have more, it means clearly that you've earned more or that you're more worthy of more. You know, this like Constantine, the Emperor Constantine idea of like the divine right to rule. Like, I have more than you because I'm better than you because God loves me more. These liberation theologists believe the opposite, that God loves poor people more, that God loves those who are suffering at the hands of others more than they love the ones who are doing the oppressing, which I think makes a lot more sense. God loves an underdog. We stand a legend. So I think that the way that Christianity has like that white capitalist conservative Christianity has twisted the figure of Jesus, if he did exist, would make him just like roll and roll and roll, would make him roll over in his empty tomb. You know what I mean? It's just like, what the actual fuck? Have you been listening to the teaching at all? And you know, every once in a while you'll meet like a really down-to-earth Christian who will be like, yeah, Jesus was a socialist or whatever. But it's pretty rare. They don't even get into that at all. They much prefer the sections of the Bible that talk about how queer people are going to hell, or, you know, how you shouldn't confront your oppressors. And that is precisely the things, the parts of Jesus that were into all that were like seeing the hypocrisy of the time and being like, we got to do something about this, whose faith and spirituality and awakening and enlightenment made him, fueled the fire in him to stand up to corrupt religious leaders or the huge oppressive institution of Rome. And as like a Jewish man, which lots and lots of white conservative Christians love to just like forget, that Jesus was, if he existed, was like a Jewish man, lived and died a Jewish man. He would understand the plight of the poor. He would understand the plight of the marginalized through generational trauma of like being enslaved and getting free and being enslaved and getting free, or just like not having full personhood in the societal structures as they existed. I was listening to another podcast, which I cannot remember the name of. Sorry about it. I should write these things down, actually. I should really start writing these things down. But I was listening to a podcast about liberation theology, and they were talking about how... oh, shit, I just lost my freaking train of thought. God damn it. Gosh darn it. Anyway, when I read about Jesus, when I learn about Jesus, when I go into a church and they have like the story of his life in the stained glass windows, you know, what really resonates with me is this commitment to equality, this willingness to die for a cause. It's the same thing that makes me feel so good that Bruce Lee existed, or, you know, the Buddha, or who else really resonates with me? Just like anyone who has brought forth some kind of valuable, you know, sometimes they end up being a little problematic. Gandhi, you know, sometimes they're not perfect humans, but they are connected to something bigger than us, and they do have like valuable information, you know, quotes that resonate with people, that help people grow, that help people see some light in what is a very difficult journey as far as being human, trapped in our human shells, you know, as spiritual beings through life. They just like inspire a deeper love in people, a deeper empathy in people, a deeper understanding, and like what eventually becomes a commitment to service. And I guess that's my favorite thing about most of the teachers who resonate with me, you know, the Eckhart Tolles, the for better or worse, like, you know, these spiritual people, these like gurus, Brene Brown, you know, they come in all shapes and sizes, all manifestations, but everyone's getting at the same basic message, whether they fully commit to leftist politics or not. There is a leftist vibe to, or at the very least, a like human compassion, which I think leftist politics lends itself to a little bit better than capitalist politics, which is very like rugged individualism, you know, like what I earn is mine and like you don't get to have any of it or whatever. It's more, I forget the word for it, but it's like service oriented. So like if you sit with yourself, if you dig deep, if you find your wounds, if you acknowledge your wounds, if you heal your wounds, if you open yourself up like a beautiful lotus flower, you know, out of the muck, and you just open and open and open, if you can retrain your thoughts out of the societal conditioning, you know, if you can realize that you're more than this physical vessel, if you can realize that life doesn't have to be suffering, that humans in fact create the suffering that we experience down here, that things can be different. If you open yourself to the truth that everyone is divine, everyone walking this planet has some little piece of God in them, if you can acknowledge and like respect that God, you become a much better listener, a much better lover, a much better partner, a much better friend, a much better parent, a much better like community member. And eventually that inner work inspires and leads you to acts of service, or like a life of service. That's why so many people who go through spiritual awakening on some level, you know, everyone who gets a tarot deck ends up reading for their friends. Anyone who gets into astrology ends up telling other people about it. That Jesus has this quote about like, if you let your light shine, if you let the world see your light, like people will be inspired by it, and it'll connect them to their own light as well. And there is this just like pay it forward quality that naturally happens in you. For me, the the inspiration to do this is that it's just like what has made me feel better. I just want to tell other people about it. What I have sat around and thought about and considered, and has like shifted my consciousness into a much more loving place, a much more open place, a much more politically active place, a much more contented place, which helps me release the capitalism, a much more self-compassionate place, which helps me release the judgment and the guilt and shame, which leads me then to a more authentic place because I'm not upset about who I am. In fact, I think that I'm pretty great. I just want to give people the same feeling I have. I want people to love themselves. I want people to feel self-compassion. I want people to stop torturing themselves with a capitalist inside their brain that's always telling them they're not doing enough. I just want to help liberate people the way that I am liberated. And you see this happen all the time. I'm so, so grateful for the spiritual teachers that I found on YouTube and for the political activists that put out free content for me to consume so that I could learn, that I want to do the same. And this happens like more often than not. People who are doing this inner work, they don't get to that place of like gatekeeping that some people get to, where they're like, I got my piece of the pie, now I want to like protect it so no one else can get any pie. I want the most pie. I don't want people to figure out how to do this. Instead, it just becomes this like cup runneth over type of situation. And I don't think that that's how like Christian white capitalists see the figure of Jesus. I think that they completely erase his Jewishness. I think that they completely try to depoliticize him, which is something historically that's been done to like every revolutionary. They're always trying to water down revolutionaries and separate them from their anti-capitalism work, from their Black liberation work, from their communist, leanings or whatever. It's like the way they treated Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., right? Like he, transcendental Black liberation activist. And now when someone gets accused of being racist on Fox News, the first thing they do is like pull out an MLK quote just to like justify their bullshit, or like gaslight people into thinking that they're not racist because they like memorized one MLK quote. But they like totally separate the truth of the matter, which was that he was a danger to the machine. He was a danger to the white supremacist, capitalist, etc. patriarchy because there's this quote, I can't remember who said it, sorry about it, where none of us can be free while any of us are enslaved. So like the Black liberation movement at that time, the civil rights movement, paved the way for lots of other liberation movements, right? Like queer and trans people learned about sit-ins from the civil rights movement, and then they started doing that too. So like Stonewall wouldn't have happened without the Black liberation movement or the civil rights movement, depending on what you want to call it. But they try to like almost whitewash Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Similarly, but a different level, like Marilyn Monroe. I read she started writing memoirs of her life. She didn't finish them because she died before she could, but she talks a little bit about communism and like the plight of the poor, because she was poor for most of her life. And she talks about how lots of powerful people in Hollywood really discouraged her from like talking about her beliefs or talking about what she was reading, because it was such a dangerous time to be a communist in Hollywood. And so like, again, depoliticize, like any intelligence, any intellectual like proclivities on her part are not remembered at all. All she's remembered for is like being sexy and like maybe fucking JFK. On the like sort of an opposite view are like the Black Panthers, who were very service-oriented people, who were very like spiritually driven political activists, but instead they're totally dehumanized into just being like violent extremists. So like you have to think about the spin and then the intention of the spin of how history, and they say history is written by the victors, right? Like who holds the power? They who hold the power write the history. And if you think about who has been in power this whole time, what stake would they have in depoliticizing or like dehumanizing or despiritualizing some of the movements that had the most success against them, or people who they want to admire or use for their own benefit, for the perpetuation of their ideals, their oppression, their power, their greed, use them for the benefit of that while leaving behind anything that went against what they believe. And so there's this depoliticization that happens with Jesus. Like, so much of what he was doing was anti-capitalist. The people he surrounded himself with, the people he fought for, the political ideologies that he was speaking about and really cared about. He was, like Malcolm X before him, executed by the state. Like, he was a danger to the power structures that were in place during his life, if he existed. I don't know why I just have to keep saying that, but it's just maybe he didn't. But even if he didn't, there's still something really powerful in the image, is there not? I mean, I know that on the one hand, Christianity has been one of the biggest means of colonization, right? If you can convince people that their faith, their connection to their land, their indigenous spirituality is wrong and bad, and you're here to save them with Jesus Christ, a blonde white dude on a cross, there's a lot of forcing Christianity on people, which is probably why it still exists today, even though it's ultimately just an amalgamation of lots of plagiarized pieces from other faiths and spiritualities, but that's besides the point. Still, as a figure, there's something there. And yeah, let's not depoliticize him. Let's be real. Practice what you preach. Listen to your figurehead. Care about other people. Be of service. Be generous. The plight of the poor is more important than the plight of the rich. The meek shall inherit the earth, right? The meek shall inherit the earth. Let's get into it, Let's stop capitalism. I also heard a really interesting point when I was doing research for this podcast episode about how, how there's this quote recently that's been floating around about how of course people are obsessed with the end of the world, with the apocalypse, because it's easier to imagine the end of the world than it is to imagine the end of capitalism. Well, in Rome, when it was in its heyday, when Jesus was around or not around or whatever, when lots of people were claiming to be the Messiah that people were, talking about was coming because the apocalypse was nigh. It's the same thing. It was it was easier to imagine the end of the world than it was to imagine the end of the Roman Empire, and that shit ended. So, spoiler alert. But people continued on. You know what I mean? So, all this to say, the truth that hierarchies don't do us any good, that a government is only as good as it takes care of its people, that there should be love in government and that there should be love in politics, and that if you're a spiritual person, you shouldn't be a love and light, coexist, platitude spewing person. You should care. You should care about the suffering of others. You shouldn't be feeling so free while other people are enslaved. And I think that's what Jesus was really getting at. If that sounds like something you'd be into, you can click the link in the description below to listen to the full episode. Also, where to find me on all the stuff is down there. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. Happy healing. Bye.